Civil Liberties Defense Center. We're based out of Eugene, but we work nationally. We've defended over 900 social justice activists for free in the 11 years that we have been an organization. And a big part of what we do, thank you. And a big part of what we do are Know Your Rights trainings, particularly for activists, but we also do them for immigrant communities, for workers, for tenants, for youth. We've got several different types of trainings. And the training that I'm going to give today is actually an updated Know Your Rights training for activists, because there are constantly new things that are happening that we want to keep really current with. But our Know Your Rights training for activists is actually up on our website. There's a video and this actual PowerPoint is up there. And the PowerPoint, we do actually keep the trainer's script as part of the PowerPoint. We do trainers trainings where we teach people how to give these trainings to their own communities so that I don't have to travel around as much. And it's important for this information to stay within different communities, especially activist communities. So if you are interested in going over it again, watching the video, learning how to do it yourself, cldc.org is our website. If you ever want us to come give your community one of these trainings, we'd be happy to do it. We love to pair it up with doing the Know Your Rights training, and then half hour later do a trainer's training where we just kind of get people primed to be able to continue giving it. So that's kind of our goal. Just to say it, I'm not forming attorney-client relationships with any of you by giving this training. This is just meant as public information. Everybody should know this stuff anyway, but we all know that public schools and public education is not really covering your civil rights and your civil liberties. So here is all my contact info. If you have a question that you don't feel comfortable asking in a public setting, feel free to email it to me, but of course recognize that email is almost more insecure than asking it in a public forum like this. So make sure that you're not giving, don't say, so I broke the law yesterday and what are my consequences? Whenever you speak to a lawyer, whether you're strategizing with a lawyer before an action or you just want to ask a question, always make sure that you frame legal questions as hypotheticals. Lawyers are actually bound by an ethical code that requires us to turn you in if you say, I'm going to break the law tomorrow. We're supposed to call the cops and be like, hey, so-and-so is going to break the law tomorrow. So never talk to lawyers and tell them we're going to break the law in the future. Always frame it as a hypothetical. And always make sure that what you're asking is, so what would the potential crimes be if we, if people did an action at a port? And what would the potential consequences be, for those crimes? Those are perfectly fine questions for you to ask a lawyer. And as you're coming up with a campaign, those are definitely questions that you should be asking, because you're about to recruit people to go potentially get arrested, and you need to be able to tell those people what to reasonably expect. That's consent. If you're not providing accurate, updated information to your campaign and you're encouraging people to go get arrested for it and they don't know what they're getting into, not only will you run off activists that will never come back to your campaign, but you're duping people, and we don't like that. We want people to knowingly and willingly, know what they're getting into. And that being said, it's never 100% predictable, what the state's going to do or how the action's going to turn out. So you got to keep that in mind too. Okay, so this training is based on primarily U.S. constitutional law, which means the stuff we're going to go over applies to any state that you may be engaged in. I'll mention a few things specific to certain states, or I will mention things that might change depending on what state you're in. But primarily, this is based on U.S. constitutional law. Everybody in the U.S. or a U.S. territory has the same constitutional rights. So whether you're documented or not, whether you are 8 months old or 80 years old, we all have the same constitutional rights. And I will go over a few little things that might be slightly different depending on where you fall on that spectrum. So probably the most important is your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. You know, if you've heard of taking the Fifth on TV, that means you are invoking your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, which literally means you never, ever, ever have to answer any questions put to you by anyone, period. The only person that can ever force you to answer a question is a judge in a courtroom. And so if you're ever confronted with a situation where you're thinking to yourself, do I really have to answer that? 99.9% of the time, the answer is no. You always have a right to refuse to answer questions. And this is literally a constitutional right. It can't be used against you to prove guilt. It can't be used against you in court. And if more people simply asserted their constitutional right, our rights would be a lot stronger. You know, the idea that only guilty people invoke their Fifth Amendment right is a massive erosion to our rights. So you should always assert your Fifth Amendment rights. Now, on some of these slides, you're going to see bright red words. And we call those the magic words because we really want you to memorize them verbatim. And the reason is twofold. Number one, when you're confronted with cops, sometimes stress and adrenaline make your brain do crazy things, and words come out of your mouth that should never come out of your mouth. And so if you've memorized some phrases, even when you're nervous or afraid, hopefully these will be the words to come out instead of some of the crazy stuff that I have to read in police reports after the fact. And then the second reason is these words are kind of framed to be legalese. You know, normal people don't talk like this. And when you spit out words like, officer, could you articulate the reasonable basis for the detention this evening? The cop is going to kind of do one of those and look around for a camera and think either you're a lawyer or your dad's a lawyer, and the dynamic between you and the cop will visibly change. We have often seen that when people use these legal phrases accurately, the cop gets a little more professional, especially if you've gotten into sort of a negative situation where a cop is really adrenalized up and misbehaving. Take a deep breath and use some of these phrases, and usually you will see a de-escalation in the cop tactics. So that's the other reason that we use those phrases. In the back, on that pink table, I have a bunch of outreach materials that you're all welcome to take. One of them is our Know Your Rights brochure. I brought it in English, Spanish, and then one for teens. And the magic phrases are in this brochure, so feel free to take one of those. Also, if you or someone you love has transdermal piercings, we'll talk about this in a second, but we have a special outreach material for transdermal piercings because we actually had to sue a couple jails for coming at people with pliers when they told jailers that they could not just remove, their transdermal piercings. Cops don't understand what they are, and so they were literally ripping people's faces up with pliers. So people with transdermals, we tell them to carry one of these in their wallet, send them to your local jail, etc., etc. Then two other materials I'll just highlight, the demand of rights and the legal system flowchart, which I will probably not go over this flowchart tonight just to spare you it. But this is literally like from the moment you get arrested to the moment you get convicted in a flowchart. And then finally, in the back, we have some scripts of what to say if the cops or FBI come to your door, come to your mom's door, your housemates answer the phone or answer the door that may not be activists. So we are really encouraging you to laminate this and stick it by the door because, like I said, some people get really nervous when the cops show up at the door. Okay, next is your Fourth Amendment, which is your right to privacy, the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. And the cops are not allowed to search you, search your house, seize your property, unless certain things happen. And the most common is that you consent to letting them search or seize you. And once you consent, you have literally waived your Fourth Amendment right. You've waived your right to privacy. And so if a cop says, "Can I search your backpack?" and you stare at him like a deer in the headlights, your silence has literally said to the cop, "Yes, officer, please search my backpack." And so the magic words that you have to say out loud is, "I do not consent. I do not consent to this search." Now, there may be certain circumstances where a cop is going to be allowed to search. You know, maybe they have a warrant or something else going on. We don't want you to have to analyze Fourth Amendment jurisprudence on the side of the road with a cop breathing down your neck. Just remember that the magic words, no matter what, are "I don't consent." If the cop then searches anyway, and it later turns out to have been an illegal search, you simply saying the words "I don't consent" will allow your lawyer to potentially get all of the evidence thrown out of court. And often that results in your charges being dropped. So no matter what, never consent to a search. But if they're gonna do it, don't resist them, don't run, things like that can make matters worse for you. And just so you know, when the cops show up at your door, whether it is a housemate, a guest, a 10-year-old, anybody who answers the door that has some semblance of authority over the house is going to be able to give them the authority to search the whole house. So they might show up on Monday asking to search or to talk to so-and-so, and you say, "I don't consent, come back with a warrant." They show up the next day because they know you're at work, and your mom or your 8-year-old answers the door and they say, "Hi, can we come in and search?" And they say yes. It undoes the refusal of consent that you gave the day before, and now they're going to be able to legally come in and search and do what they want. So be aware of that. The other most common way is that the cops get a search warrant. A search warrant is a piece of paper that is signed by a judge. The cop brings it to a judge. The judge has to sign it. It says when they're allowed to search, where they're allowed to search, what they're allowed to take. If you're home when they show up with a search warrant, you have the right to inspect the warrant. You get to read it. If you're not home when they show up with a warrant, they're allowed to bust down the door and enter without asking anyone to do anything. And so if the cops are knocking on the door and you hear "police warrant," hiding under the couch, going to the kitchen is not going to be very helpful, because they are going to bust the door down, and then when they find you, they're going to be extra aggravated that you were hiding from them, because they are constantly in fear of being shot and killed by everyone. So if the cops show up with a warrant, we suggest that you, if you're going to open the door and move out of the doorway. Very often people are seriously injured by the door flying open because the cops are going to just shut it because they're afraid that somebody's hiding behind it. So think about your own safety in these split seconds. You want to be out of the way of the door. You always want the cops to be able to see your hands so they don't think you're reaching for a gun or something like that. And then they will normally make you sit on the couch while they run around rifling through all your stuff. When they leave, they are required to give you a piece of paper showing what they took. Now, if you read the warrant and it says they can search the house, but there's no mention of your cars, and you look out the window and they're rifling through your glove box in your car, you don't want to say, "Oh, hey, car is not on this piece of paper, officer," because there's such a thing as a telephonic warrant. The cops just have to get on the cell phone to a judge and say, "Oh, we forgot car. Can you add car to this?" And judge says, "Add car," and now car is a legal place to search. So if you see them going beyond the bounds of the warrant, lie low, let your lawyer know, and potentially that's a way to get that evidence out of the case. All right. There are certain situations where there will be exceptions to the warrant requirement. So, things like the hot pursuit. Murderer is running down the street and runs in your garage. The cops do not have to go get a warrant, nor do they have to ask you for consent before they run into your garage. They nab the murderer, and then they look around and they find your meth lab. They are now able to bust you for the meth lab because of another exception called the plain view exception, which means if cops see anything illegal in plain view, they're allowed to deal with it. You know, they walk by your house and they see your meth lab on the coffee table. They're going to be able to enter your home without a warrant or consent to bust you for the meth lab. And that's the plain view exception. You know, I've had activist clients who had a found chainsaw in the back of their Subaru, and the cops were able to look in the back and see X logging company chainsaw in plain view, and now are able to bust this person for burglary and theft of the chainsaw. That's an example of plain view. So anywhere you or I could go, a cop can go. And anything you and I can see in that vantage point, if the cops see it, they can bust you for it. The community caretaking exception is often used, and this is when the cops claim, we heard screaming and we thought someone was dying inside the house, so we decided we could enter the house under this community caretaking exception. Abused by cops all the time, and not a lot you can do about it when they are claiming that that's what's going on. Automobile exception, if you get stopped driving your car, they're going to be able to search anywhere in your wingspan. You know, so anywhere that you can reach, the cop is going to be able to look inside the car without a warrant and without consent. However, the trunk or areas of the vehicle that you cannot reach to grab a weapon to hurt them, they will need a warrant, just the same as normal.
Is that inclusive of the glove box?
The glove box is normally somewhere that you could reach and pull out a, you know, something. So yes, normally the glove box is fair game for them, as well as the console between the seats and things like that. And when you are being detained, which we're going to talk about, you know, what that word means, but once a cop has a legal reason to be able to hold on to you, they're then going to be able to also do a pat-down search of you for weapons only. They're only supposed to be ensuring their safety under those circumstances, but they're allowed to do so, again, in your wingspan. So, you know, for instance, when we give this training to homeless activists, we tell them, if you see a cop walking toward you in a purposeful way, put some distance between you and your backpack. Don't let your backpack be within your wingspan, because now the cop's going to be able to look in your backpack for weapons. But if you're beyond a wingspan distance, then they now need a warrant to get into the backpack. And so when your home is your backpack, you want to make sure that they, you know, don't get in there. And even though they're only supposed to be looking for weapons, because of the plain view exception, if they open up the backpack looking for weapons and then find an illegal knife or heroin or something like that, they're now allowed to bust you for that too. So those are the basic exceptions to the warrant requirement. Your First Amendment, right to change. This is your right to assemble, which means gathering up with other people. You know, assembling is a constitutional right. You are not normally required to get a permit to do it. You don't have to ask permission to do it. You know, assembling is one of your First Amendment rights, along with free speech, which we all really self-censor ourselves with regard to free speech. Free speech covers nudity, profanity, burning the American flag, advocating for the overthrow of government. You know, all of these things are fully protected under your free speech rights. What isn't covered is really kind of simple. You know, yelling fire in a crowded movie theater, or making a true threat of violence. You know, if I have a knife in my hand and I say I'm going to kill you, that could be a true threat of violence. But me standing here being like, if you don't sit here for this entire training, I'm going to kill you, you know, that is not a true threat of violence, because I have no means to actually affect it. That's sort of where the line is drawn there. People often ask me, you know, can we write to X corporation and say, if you continue polluting our river, you're going to really rue the day that you messed with us, or something like that. And I always tell people, you know, you've got a First Amendment right to say that. There's nothing unconstitutional about that. But imagine that being read to the jury at your trial. You know, Because of course you know that that corporation is going to attempt to use it in the worst way possible. So yes, it's First Amendment protected, but that doesn't mean that you should necessarily do it. Just for those that may work with undocumented communities, you know, like I said, everybody has the same First Amendment rights. But if you're here on a visa or you know, any kind of green card, the conditions of getting that permission said, I will not engage in political activity. And when we go travel to other countries on a visa, we actually agree to that as well. So if an undocumented person gets busted at a protest, they could potentially be subject to deportation because of violating that, you know, engaging in political activity clause. So they have a little extra risk there. Yes, Canadian citizen.
What about First Nations?
Do you mean in other countries? So you here?
I was born in Canada, but the medicine line is the medicine line.
Uh-huh.
And so we were free to roam back and forth.
Uh-huh.
And so where does it fit for myself being a Canadian?
Well, so when you cross the border, do you have to show Canadian citizenship?
I can show my passport, or I can show my status card, which has the ability to be used as an identification across the border.
Uh-huh. I think that you could potentially be in the same ballpark that I'm in if I go to Canada, which is if they want to mess with me and deport me on those grounds, they probably could have legal grounds to do so. That being said, I know that Canada's tribal laws are a lot stronger and better than U.S. tribal laws, so you may have a better leg to stand on than a Native American activist here in the U.S. would. So I can't say for 100% how strong or weak that argument would be. But you're not on a visa, which is another, you know, thing. Although Canada has been really strict with U.S. activists. You know, if you've ever been arrested in the U.S. for the silliest CD action ever, you know, good luck getting into Canada these days. Something, yeah.
What about slander or defamation?
Thank you for reminding me that. Yeah, so that's the other category of unprotected First Amendment rights. Slander, libel are two forms of what's called defamation, defaming someone, which means that you are intentionally telling a knowing falsehood about someone or something, corporation, that causes economic harm. It has to cause economic harm. So me telling your girlfriend that you have a loathsome disease is not defamation because you don't have economic harm. But you saying that McDonald's serves pigeon, if you know that's false and not true, because that's likely to cause economic harm, you would potentially be the target of defamation by that standard.
So how does that? It says ExxonMobil is destroying the world, and like, of course, they would say that's not and is causing economic harm. So like, how?
Well, you have to knowingly know it's false, and you, of course, would argue that Exxon really is destroying the world. And there's plenty of other pieces of evidence that you could bring into your case showing that Exxon is destroying the world. So they would have a very, very weak case there. Yes.
I watch Judge Judy sometimes.
Oh boy. Okay.
And they're always trying to countersue for defamation of character. Does that exist, and what is it?
Defamation of character is the same thing as defamation, what we were just talking about. It has to be a knowing falsehood about another person that causes economic harm.
It does have to cause.
Yeah. Which can be professional harm, just to be clear with you. You know, so like if someone defamed me and said, you know, I'm a lying quack or something like that, and I then can't find a client to save my life, you know, that could be my economic harm.
Yeah.
So I'm working on a political campaign right now, and they send out mailers saying that our candidate, they like with all these lies, and I'm wondering how they can get away with that.
Well, public figures and political issues, there's a tougher test. You know, if you defame a movie star or a politician, they actually have harder stuff that they have to prove to get you for defamation. So the political world, we all know that A, they defame each other all the time, and B, they knowingly lie all the time. So they have a slightly different standard. Okay, so this was one of the photos that Tripp was mentioning from Eastern Oregon. And these are folks standing in the roadway with probably a light board that Bill and his crew taught them how to make. But they are standing in a roadway, i.e. disorderly conduct, prohibitively blocking a roadway. And so just by standing in this roadway, all of these folks are subject to arrest, though normally we would expect that law enforcement would give them the opportunity to leave before they would be arrested. It doesn't always happen that way. These days, with actions, normally people are breaking into green, orange, red, meaning green is the lowest risk of arrest possible. Red is I'm going to go get arrested. I'm more likely than not going to get arrested. And orange is sometimes the support crew or people who are taking some risk but are hoping not to get arrested. But there's really never a situation that is entirely green. Because you just, especially in rural areas with climate justice organizing, you never fully know what the cops are going to do. And so even these folks, out in this photo could have faced arrest, which is why it's important for everyone to be up on their Know Your Rights trainings. For activists, your rights are based on where you choose to protest. This is called the forum. The area that you choose to protest is called a forum in Lawyerland. And there are 3 different classifications. There's a public forum and a private forum, and then in the middle is this thing called quasi-public forums. And a public forum is where you have the most First Amendment rights. This is things like public sidewalks, public roadways, the plaza in front of your courthouse, national forests, public parks, anywhere that historically we would expect free speech to happen is called a public forum. And literally, the state cannot censor your First Amendment rights under most circumstances. The only restrictions that they can put on your rights are what are called reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. And what that means is, under certain circumstances, they could say, yeah, you can exercise your First Amendment rights, but it has to be before 11 p.m. You can't have a sign with a stick. There are different things that I'm sure you've all heard about where they seem to impose, the worst that I loathe are where, for mass protests, where they will designate a free speech area. This is a designated time, place, and manner restriction that the courts have upheld. So yeah, you've got a right to protest on a public sidewalk, an absolute First Amendment right. However, in modern days, they're imposing more and more of these time, place, and manner restrictions. Like, you can't go to your federal building and hold a sign on the street corner unless you apply to Homeland Security for a permit first. That is another example of one of these time, place, and manner restrictions. Quasi-public forums are things like college campuses. There might be areas that are free speech oriented, like your student union, but me parading into a biology classroom to protest dissecting frogs, no First Amendment rights for me there. And then private forums are things like malls, inside malls, Walmart's parking lot, my backyard. Those are all private forums, and the owner or person in charge of those forums has absolute discretion to kick you out for any reason. So you're in my backyard, all I have to say is leave or be arrested. I don't have to have a reason. I may have a really bad reason. And it doesn't matter. If I tell you to leave and you refuse to leave, you're going to be arrested for trespassing. And the same, like I said, with malls and private areas. So if you're planning an action, like for instance, Tripp mentioned the one that just happened outside the Seneca biomass facility, you need to do some research. You need to figure out where are the public right-of-ways. There's usually a strip of land between the road and the private fence that is a public right-of-way. And normally that strip can be your free speech area. If you are too close, or if you're in the area that the corporation has an easement as their driveway, if you're in the driveway, that's their private property and they can arrest you at any point. If you're beyond their fence line, that's private property, they can arrest you at any point. But by going to your city land use office or your county land use office, putting in the address, pulling up what's called a plat map, you will literally see where things are public and where things are private, and you can plan your action accordingly. And I would just suggest bring copies of those documents if you think you're going to have trouble from the cops, because often the cops are just going to come up with BS reasons to move you on. If you can pull out a plat map and say, the city says this is my public right of way, and I'm going to sue you if you violate my constitutional rights to be here, you're literally giving them evidence that will allow you to really screw them if they do end up violating your rights. So that's important in your early campaign stages, is to make sure you know where you're sending people and what the risk of arrest is in that particular area. So the other restriction sometimes on First Amendment rights is based on content. Incitement and advocacy of crime. I stand up before you and I say, let's all get spears and head down to Destructo Corporation and tell them who's boss. I have just incited you all to go commit riot and possibly other crimes, and since it's being recorded and since there are infiltrators here amongst us, I could be in serious trouble for doing that. One really common one is people, will say things like snitches get stitches. If you're an informant or you become a snitch, you deserve to die. And so the legal test is, saying what you think is moral propriety, telling other people what you think is right or wrong, cannot be seen as incitement or advocacy of crime. Saying, hey, Fluff, take this knife and go stab so-and-so because they're a snitch, that would obviously be incitement of murder and other things like that. The other thing that is kind of a gray area that I just put up here to, make sure you're aware, hate speech. Hopefully no one in this room would ever, be caught up in something like that. But, saying something that is deemed to be hate speech against a suspect class, which is your race and ethnicity, et cetera, in many states they will have hate crime statutes specific to the state. So this is one of those things that varies from place to place, but, and like I said, unlikely that anyone here needs to worry about that, but just so you know that it's up there. Okay, so I mentioned the Fifth Amendment makes you so that you never have to answer any questions put to you by anyone except for a judge in a courtroom. And this is super important. You never know what the feds or cops are investigating. They may say that they're investigating this broken window over here, but really they're investigating an arson on the other side of town. And they may be asking you weird questions about so-and-so, but really they're asking you those questions because so-and-so actually gave them a different story than what you're currently telling them, and now that makes both of you suspects in the crime. So you should never talk to police or government agents at all. And if you absolutely feel like you have to, you need to do it with a lawyer present so that you have a witness to what you're saying and so that you can get legal advice. However, there is an arcane tool of repression that has particularly been used against radical political movements historically, called the grand jury system. And what happens is grand juries can be convened to investigate any felony crime. So whether it's drugs or politics or whatever, if a prosecutor can come up with a potential felony, they can convene a grand jury to investigate you and your movement. And they often use this as a harassment tactic, because once the feds show up at your house and deliver you a grand jury subpoena, you now have a choice. You can either testify against the people you work with and give information to the state who is normally who you're opposing, and be basically labeled a snitch for the rest of your activist career, or you could go to jail for refusing to testify. A very awful, terrible decision for every activist to make. But historically, you look at this, and this is a perfect tactic for them to use against powerful, effective leaders of movements. So the person standing in front of the camera, the charismatic megafauna who leads your campaign, becomes quite a target for a grand jury subpoena if the feds decide that that's a great way to shut down the campaign, because now that person is ripped out of your campaign and it now gets to make legal land their campaign, and literally faces jail time or literally being run out of the campaign and their effectiveness completely destroyed. And in the meantime, the whole campaign that loves that megafauna stops doing the campaign work and is now focused on jail support and grand jury activism. So it can be a super effective tactic for the state. And that's all I'm going to say about it now. We actually do a separate 1-hour training on grand juries. If your community is ever affected by them, call us and we will quickly come and give you support and more trainings. But just know that when you are grand jury subpoenaed, they will give you immunity so that you don't have Fifth Amendment rights anymore, which is why you end up having to choose between going to jail or snitching out your movement. So, don't answer to any questions ever put to you by anyone. Okay, so some basic tips about interacting with cops. Remember that they are trained to investigate and interrogate. So they know all the tricks to get you to say things or to feel intimidated or to feel scared. Anything you say can and will be used against you and others. This includes gestures, darting eyes, fidgeting with your hands. As soon as a cop approaches you, they are studying you like a hawk and everything that you're doing, saying, etc. And so as soon as a cop approaches you, you're on. You have to get into serious mode about how you're going to interact with that cop, which is what we're kind of warming up to. Although cops are allowed to lie to you for any purpose whatsoever, you're not allowed to lie to cops. If you give them a false name, a false age, that's actually a crime. Again, it's better to say nothing than to say something that could be incriminating. Keep your hands visible and make sure that you don't make any quick movements. Like I said, they're scared to death that you're going to whip out a newsie and shoot them, even if you're an 85-year-old grandmother sitting in a lawn chair. And so, if you're in your car, put your hands on the steering wheel so they can see them, and then wait for them to instruct you to pull out your license and registration. If you are on the streets, we generally suggest put them right down by your sides and glue them to your legs, because everybody gets nervous and you're going to start doing this and doing this and doing this. This to cops and lawyers means you're lying. If you're playing with your mouth, that means the words coming out of your mouth are untruthful, and we study this stuff. Everything that you do going like this means you're defiant and you're disagreeable and you're not listening and you're closed off and blah blah blah. So every gesture you make means something, but this means you're open and honest and non-threatening and all sorts of things. And it gives you something to do with your muscles and your body, and it's safe. So stick them to your legs. You never have to move. Hold on one second. Let me finish the slide and I'll get your question. You never have to move from where the cops find you. So if a cop comes up to you and says, come down this dark alley, I want to ask some questions of you, you have the right to say, no thanks, I would rather stay right here. And you should never go off with cops somewhere else. It looks sketchy as hell to your comrades, and now you don't have witnesses, and all sorts of things can happen. So stay in a public, well-lit area with lots of witnesses. Don't go anywhere. If, of course, you're placed under arrest and they put the handcuffs on you, then they're allowed to march you off to a cop car and take you to jail. And almost all cops and cop cars are now rigged with audio and video recording capabilities. So you should absolutely assume that as soon as you're having any contact with a cop, they are at least audio recording you through that little walkie-talkie you see on them. That is a one-way microphone. When you're in the cop car, there's actually a camera on the rear view mirror pointed at you in the back seat of the car, as well as cameras pointing out the front, which is usually where they'll make you do field sobriety tests if you get stopped for drunk driving. But just know that those cameras are generally running all the time. I actually had to defend someone who, while the cameras were rolling, went up with a Sharpie marker and wrote on the front of a cop car, you know, pigs suck or something, while the camera fully picked it up in the light of day. So clearly he hadn't come to one of our trainings and got charged with criminal mischief for it. Question?
Are you always required to give name, age, etc.? Identifying.
We'll get to that.
Question on this part. So is a TSA agent considered a cop in this case?
Yes, for the purposes of this training, anybody with a gut badge, any government agent, campus security, all of them are considered cops for the purpose of this training in terms of what rules apply to them and what rights you have for them.
And if we suspect that they're not a cop and they're just faking it?
Meaning they're plain clothed?
No, meaning that the classic line is, oh, I'm a cop and I abuse, undocumented immigrants. That's the common line we hear all the time.
So they're saying I'm a cop and they're in uniform, are you
Some
saying?
person puts on a uniform and
Oh,
extorts somebody.
it's a tough
Okay.
situation. Yeah, that's kind of a, hopefully it doesn't ever happen to you, situation that's very, very rare.
Will you talk about recording the cops?
Okay. Okay, so now we're going to segue to interacting with cops on the street or at your demo or your action or whatnot. And the way we break this down is there's 3 different levels of interacting with cops. Mere conversation at the lowest level, detention, and then arrest. And the reason we want you to think in terms of these 3 stages is because there's different rights and responsibilities with each one of these things. And so, trying to identify which one of these levels you are at will be quite helpful for you. If the cop says, do this and be arrested, they'll tell cop watchers, go across the street or we're going to arrest you. When a cop says that, you should assume that they will follow through on their words. And so if you refuse a cop order, even if you know that it's totally illegal, you should at least expect to go to jail. We might be able to get the charges dismissed. We may even be able to sue the cops for you and make some money for you in the campaign, but you're still going to go to jail that day. And so if your intention is to get your video off-site or to not go to jail because of a million different reasons why, if a cop says, stand on your head and spit nickels, you better do that or you could face arrest. Okay, so at the mere conversation stage, I have the right to walk up to any one of you and ask you for your bank account balance. And of course, you have the right to tell me that you don't want to give me that. A cop also has the right to go anywhere the public can go and ask you anything that they want to ask. But just like you could tell me to go to hell, you can tell a cop that you don't want to answer their questions. we won't advise on using the naughty language, but we do say, so at the mere conversation stage, a couple of important things. One is that you don't have to show any ID. They can't pat you down or search you or anything, and you have the right to simply say, I don't wish to speak with you, and then slowly walk away from them. But how do you figure out whether you're at the conversation stage or detention or arrest? You ask the question, am I being detained or am I free to go? Either one. Am I being detained? It's a yes or no question, right? The cop either says, yes, you're being detained, or no, you're not being detained. If he says no, that means you're at mere conversation and you have the right to simply walk away. And we suggest, what we advise is you just say, I'd rather not speak with you, and then slowly walk away. We say slowly because if they change their mind and decide to jump you as you're trotting away, and booking looks really sketchy and suspicious, so don't go running off, but just get yourself away from that cop. Especially at a demo, I often see a cop go up, who's the leader of your protest? You know, what are you guys here for? And the person will say, our police liaison is over there, which is the perfect answer to give. And then they stand there next to the cop, and the cop's like, what are you afraid of? Why don't you want to talk to me? I'm a person too, blah, 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 blah. And if they had, and then eventually they might say, by the way, what's that bulge in your pants? Is that a knife? Let me see it. You know, and all of a sudden the person's in the back seat of a cop car. So if the cop gives you a way to move and walk away, put distance between you and the cop. If you are stopped in your car, just to say it, you, as the driver of a vehicle, must produce ID, but we'll get to that in a second. So, am I being detained? If he says yes, then we're on to level 2, detention. Yeah.
What if they say you can't leave, but they don't say leave, then they don't detain you?
If they say you can't leave, you should say you're detaining me. You know, use that word, because what we'll see here, the way you determine whether you are being detained, you say, are you detaining me? If the cop says yeah, or he says you're not free to leave, you know, your next question should be why? Why am I being detained? Because the cop has to articulate the reasonable suspicion that he has that you have either committed a crime or are about to commit a crime. Committing a crime and about to commit a crime are the only 2 reasons that the cop is allowed to hold you, that you're not free to walk away. So the cop walks up to you and says, you know, who's the leader of your movement, blah, 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 and you say, are you detaining me or am I free to leave? And he says, you're not free to leave, or I'm detaining you, or, you know, anything like that. That means you're at level 2. That means you're 1 foot away from the backseat of a cop car. This cop thinks that you've committed a crime and wants to arrest you, basically. So then you really know to put on your serious face. So if a cop reasonably suspects that you have been involved in a crime, they are allowed to detain you. Once they're allowed to legally detain you, then you are required to identify yourself. This does not mean that you have to hand over your identification. It simply means that you have to give your name, address, and date of birth. There are 2 reasons that we advise that you do not simply whip out your privilege and hand it to a cop. Number 1, there are lots of people in our country that are undocumented that cannot obtain identification. And by you simply whipping out your ID when you don't have to, you are putting more pressure and more specter onto undocumented people. And so, if at all possible, you should not just simply whip out that privilege and hand it to the cop. If the cop says, let me see your ID, you should say, officer, my name is this, my address is this, my date of birth is this. And he says, you know, let me see your ID, blah, blah, blah. This lawyer told me in Washington, in Oregon, we're not required to produce identification, and so I am giving you my name, address, date of birth. The second reason that you should not give up your state licensed driver's license or state ID is on the back of your license is an RFID chip. And that strip, that magnetic strip, when they run it back in the cop car, comes up with all sorts of shit about you that you don't know about. Every crime you've ever committed, any arrests you've had, if you're on any lists, which almost all of us are now, you know, all sorts of notes that the cops and federal authorities place on you is contained on that little strip. And so why would you give them all of that additional information when you don't have to? And when I say this, I want to make sure that you understand there will be cops that are ignorant of the law that will threaten to arrest you if you don't cough up your ID. And I'm not telling you that to go to jail, you know, if that happens. You have to think on your feet and use common sense, obviously. But it is absolutely 100% your constitutional right and totally legal in Washington, Oregon, West Coast, most states. I think 34 out of 50 states, you are not required to produce photo ID when you are being detained by the cops. Only if you are the driver of a motor vehicle. And if the car gets stopped and the cops walk up and say, driver, let me see your license, you have to produce a license because that's your license to drive. But the passengers do not need to produce ID. When you're on your bike, no ID. The one slight exception to this, and it's not really an exception, but if you look under 21 and you are drunk off you might want to carry your ID to prove that you're over 21. Because sometimes people can get detained under suspicion of being underage and intoxicated or something like that. And that would be, one little category where having a photo ID might be helpful to you.
Just to be clear, so this is an exception to the Fifth Amendment that you do have to identify yourself?
Correct. If you don't give name, address, or date of birth when you are being detained, then they're allowed to take you to the jail to run your fingerprints to attempt to identify you.
If you don't have an address.
You are absolutely legally entitled to say that you are transient. If you have permission from a household to use their address, you are legally allowed to use that address. And as an activist tip, if you're getting arrested in Washington, it is ideal to have permission to use a Washington address because you're going to be more likely to be able to get out of jail on your own without having to post bail and stuff like that. Saying that you're transient is a perfectly legal answer, but it may make it harder for you to get out of jail because the jails will view you as a higher risk.
Well, just wanted to clarify, you only are required to identify yourself if you're being detained? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
So if the cop is just trying to chat you up and is just like, what's your name? You're like,
You're not
we're
required
to
Yeah.
tell you that. And they're like, well, you have to tell me, because they say that all the time, like you're legally obligated to, but they're not actually detaining you.
And then you say, are you detaining me?
Cool.
And, like I said, often, just using the word detain, often, all of a sudden the cop is going to back off. A common example is, am I being detained, why am I being detained? Because I said so. If I had $1 for every time that was the cop response to that question, I would be a very wealthy woman. And the follow-up that we usually advise, if you are able to spit this out, the cop says, because I said so, your response is, officer, I believe you're required to articulate the reasonable suspicion you have for detaining me this evening. And then that's recorded, and everything that happens after that can literally be thrown out of court based on their failure to provide you with that response. We can practice that later if you'd like.
Can you repeat that one?
Yes, it's officer, could you please articulate the reasonable suspicion that you are detaining me this evening or today or whatever. Yeah.
Hypothetically speaking, if that magnetic strip was exposed to a rare earth magnet, a powerful magnet, would that somehow interrupt the flow of information that may not get, or would it cause a worse problem?
I can't say that I have any practical experience with that actually coming up as an issue. It certainly doesn't address the other reason we don't want you to give up an ID. And I'm not sure, I think that once they have your driver's license number, they probably could manually enter it into a computer and have the information pop up.
Anyway, okay.
Yeah.
So I was just curious, in Mississippi, a couple of years ago, they were setting up checkpoints where everyone in the car was being asked for identification. Is that illegal, or is it just depend on the state?
Was it the driver?
It was everyone in the car.
Everyone in the car? Checkpoints are a little different of a situation. Checkpoints have been ruled to be legal for certain purposes. If they are looking for a wanted suspect, they may be able to ask for ID from everyone because they have a reasonable suspicion you might be that person. DUI checkpoints, immigration checkpoints, all of those. Personally, I think they are totally illegal, but the courts have upheld them as a useful police tool, so they're kind of an exception to some of these rules. But what I would say is, it is not a crime to refuse or to not have ID on you if you're the non-driver. So they say cough up an ID. If if you don't have one, and you say, name is this, address is this, date of birth is this, they shouldn't be charging you or arresting you with something based on that. Lamar.
In relation to checkpoints, is there supposed to be some sort of protocol, like they stop every vehicle, every 2 vehicles get stopped, or how, or?
They do have to have a protocol. They don't have to tell you what it is. They come up with it while they're standing on the side of the road. Every 3 cars, every red car, every brown person in a car, it could be anything, anything. So, it's not very helpful. Let's see. Oh yeah, so, cops at the detention stage, they're allowed to do that pat-down search. Say, I don't consent to this search. You are allowed to have a person of your own gender conduct that search. Women, really, tell them to bring the female cop to the side of the highway. Be as big of a pain in the ass as you can, really. If you're in a county where there are no female cops, they're going to be able to use a male cop. So it's not a foolproof situation, but it's always good to try. For people who identify as trans, law enforcement, cops, jails, etc., go by your biological anatomy. So if you haven't fully transitioned, you're going to be based on the physical anatomy that you possess, regardless of the other factors. All right. Cops can lie. I mentioned that to you. They can promise that you won't go to jail, that if you snitch on so-and-so, they'll let you go. None of it is enforceable at all. If a cop really wants to make a promise to you, they will do so in front of your lawyer. Otherwise, you don't be duped. Okay, and then the final level, arrest. When the cop says, you're under arrest. Sometimes it just goes 0 to 100, where the cop just walks up to you out of the blue and is like, you're under arrest, because they've been monitoring cameras or whatever happens to be the case. You should immediately say, I want to exercise my Fifth Amendment right, or here's the simple way. I want to remain silent and I want a lawyer. That statement is the invocation of Fifth Amendment rights. It puts a magic bubble around you that makes it so that the police must stop questioning you. Once you say that phrase, they are no longer allowed to question you without your lawyer present. So, and if you then get chatty in the back of the cop car and start talking about the weather, you've just popped your own bubble. Now they're allowed to start questioning you again. But just by repeating the phrase and saying, I want to remain silent, I want a lawyer, that's the invocation of Fifth Amendment rights again, and now you're back to having that right asserted for you. So if you go to jail, you are allowed to make a reasonable number of phone calls in a reasonable amount of time, which reasonably gives cops lots of reasonable discretion to mess with you if they want to. But it's not just one phone call, and you should definitely know that every single call, whether it's to your lawyer or your girlfriend, is absolutely being recorded by the jail. Every word. So be very careful what you're saying. Especially panicked activists calling their jail support line. Should not be saying, hey, is this our jail support line? Because then you're telling how we work to the state. The less the state knows about us and can psychologically profile from us, the better. So be very, very careful with what you're sharing over jail phones. Also, know that you could be in a jail cell with an informant, with an undercover cop, so don't be chit-chatty business in a jail cell with others. If you have a medical condition, you have to be a real squeaky wheel to get some semblance of medical care in a jail. Even if you have your inhaler in your pocket or your insulin in your pocket, they're not going to be able to give it to you. It has to come in from a pharmacy, through your doctor, through a prescription, and can sometimes take 24 to 48 hours before those medications will be available to you. So if you have those types of conditions, consider that when you are thinking about getting arrested, because it can be much more difficult. And as I mentioned, people who identify as trans, if, just to give an example, the anatomy is still biologically male, but by all outward appearances they are female, they will not be allowed to be housed with women in the jail. They will be housed with men. They have the right to be held in segregation, or medical segregation, which for short duration jail stints is what I advise. If a trans person goes to jail and is put in an area that they feel very unsafe in, they should agree or request to go to seg. Because for a couple of days, seg is fine and is probably safer. For long duration incarceration, seg sucks, but for these purposes, I would recommend it. And whether you are a vegan, which we don't have to provide you a vegan diet, but whether you have diet restrictions, whether you have medical conditions, whether something is wrong inside the jail, there is a written grievance procedure that every jail has, and you must initiate that as soon as possible if you've got a problem going on. If the cop says you are under arrest, that means that the cop has probable cause to believe that you have broken the law. They may witness you break the law because you're locked down to the front doors of Bank of America, or they may have a single informant telling them that you have dead bodies in your basement. And under both circumstances, that may be probable cause to arrest you. Just being arrested does not mean that you are guilty, and it doesn't mean you've been convicted of anything. It just means that now you get sucked into the legal process. And there are 3 different levels of criminal charges. Infractions or violations are the lowest level. These are things like dog at large, it can be a speeding ticket, and sometimes certain crimes can be labeled violations or infractions. Like if anybody went to the rendezvous, they may very well have ended up with an infraction because they were giving them out like candy. An infraction means no jail, no probation. The only thing the court can do to you is fine you money. And sometimes they will allow you to convert the money into community service. A misdemeanor, however, is the next level up. Well, some part of the slide is missing. But a misdemeanor means that you can go to jail for up to 1 year. The fines are usually maxed out at about $6,250. They can put you on up to 5 years of unsupervised probation, which means you don't have a PO, you don't have a probation officer, you don't have to piss in a cup, you don't have to maintain a job. All of these things are conditions of probation if you are charged with a felony. Felony is the most serious level crime. You carry prison time, probation with a probation officer, your gun rights can get taken away, your voting rights can get taken away, and you're normally required to give your DNA to the federal government. All from being convicted of a felony, which used to be rare in activist land and is getting more and more common, particularly charging activists with felonies, where the cops and prosecutors know there's very little chance that you'll ever get convicted of it. But just by charging you with a felony means that you now have a bunch of bail and a bunch of extra conditions that you have to adhere to while you wait for your trial date. And so one trend we're seeing, which I will try not to duplicate the tonight training, but right now we're seeing the state charge activists with felonies and then postpone their trials for like a year. And so for the whole time period that they're waiting for their court date where they get to prove their innocence, they're basically a convicted felon. They can't leave the state, they have to check in once a week. If they get arrested again, they're in big, big trouble. So they're benched. You know, as soon as you are arrested for an activist case these days, because of pre-trial release conditions, you're basically benched from any kind of arrest scenario in the future. When you're arrested, they're allowed to do a skin search, which basically means, now you're going into a jail. That's different than a strip search, which is when they look inside your orifices. A skin search basically means they make you take all your clothes off, but they're not doing any kind of probing. Has to be a person of your own gender. And this is where they will require you to remove those transdermal piercings. So people with transdermals who put themselves in arrest situations, like I mentioned, we've got a special brochure for that because we've had to sue several jails for ripping people's faces out as they went at them with pliers.
What are transdermal?
Transdermal piercings, have you ever seen those piercings that looks like a little diamond in somebody's cheek or like between their eyes? Our brochure actually has a photo. What happens is the piercing goes in their cheek and then it opens up inside like a butterfly. And so the person can't just take that out themselves. A piercer has to come and use a special tool to be able to get it out without, you know, ripping a big hole in the person's face. So it looks like that on this little picture. And we sent these around to every jail in Oregon, telling them if you ever do it again, we'll sue your ass. But we didn't do it for Washington, so you may want to on your own.
So how do they require you to remove those?
They will demand it, and you have to basically say you need to bring in a piercer. And normally they will either have a piercer on duty that comes to the jail to do it, or more and more in bigger jails, medical staff now have the tool that piercers use in order to get them out properly. Okay, this is your demand of rights. You've probably heard of Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can will be used against you in a court of law. They don't have to read you your Miranda rights anymore. There were some cases that came out of the U.S. Supreme Court that said no longer do they have to read those to you. And because I told you earlier that cops lie, you should not be relying on liar cops to tell you what your rights are. It is not in their best interest to educate you as to your constitutional rights in these situations. So you should know them. And this is our kind of simplified version of it. Don't talk to anyone about anything. Because who's the only person that can make you answer a question? A judge in a courtroom. You want a lawyer present before you speak to anyone. You know, don't make any statements to anyone. At least make sure that you've got a witness. You know, if you say in front of a cop, the sun rises in the east, and they write in the report, she said the sun rises in the west, it's now your word against the cop's word, which is a very bad place for you to be. So at a minimum, you want a lawyer as a witness. In Oregon, you will be in jail for 48 hours maximum before you are arraigned, before you're brought in front of a judge and you're entitled to a lawyer. In Washington and California, it's 72 hours. So in a worst case scenario, you might have to wait 3 days before a lawyer is appointed to you to be present. But if it's gotten to the point where you're being charged with a crime, or they're trying to get a confession out of you, or they're looking for a statement, it is absolutely in your best interest to wait for that lawyer, because you are just screwing yourself if you make statements to the cops under serious circumstances. Don't agree to, I won't answer any questions or reply to any charges without your lawyer present. This includes your arraignment, which we'll talk about in a minute. Don't agree to perform any tests, consent to any searches, participate in a lineup. All of those things, they need a warrant. They have to go to a judge and get a demand to take your voice exemplar, hair sample, handwriting, footprint, lineups where they put you and 5 people that supposedly look like you. All of those things they are required to get a warrant for. But if they say, we want you to do a lineup, and you don't know any better, and you just follow them to the lineup, you've just consented to it, and now there's no way to fight about whether it's legal or not. So no matter what they tell you they want you to do, you should say, I don't consent to it. If they force you to do it, and it turned out to be illegal, you'll have an argument to make in court. Don't sign anything. Oh, so there's an exception to this testing thing. Drunk driving. When you got a license, you agreed to perform non-testimonial field sobriety tests, which means those tests that don't make you snitch on yourself. So watching the pen or nose, hands to nose, you're not snitching on yourself for those. But how many drinks have you had? Count to 100. How many, how do you think you performed on these tests? Those are questions that make you snitch on yourself, and you're not required to perform those. Now, when you're wasted on the side of the road and they're asking you these questions, you're generally not in a great mindset to be distinguishing between these things. So again, we want you to say, I don't consent to any tests I'm not required to take. And then they will tell you, you have to do these. Breath tests where they make you blow into the thing. If you refuse that, you lose your license for a year, regardless of whether you end up getting convicted of drunk driving or not. Because when you got a license, you consented to that test. And if you don't take it, you've breached your contract with them, and now they can take away your license for a year. Don't sign anything except for a jail release agreement. If you don't sign a jail release agreement, they won't let you out of jail. So we usually say, sign it, get out of jail, and if it has crazy conditions in it, go to your lawyer, we can go to court and fight to get those conditions taken away, but you might as well get out of jail. Because if you don't sign that agreement, then you're staying in jail. And finally, if there's one thing that you take away from this training, if you can spit out, I will not waive any of my constitutional rights, you have like bare bones covered your butt.
Question?
Yes.
Are those applicable for all states or just Washington, Oregon?
The demand of rights?
Yeah.
They are applicable everywhere.
So then, when you're getting booked, is fingerprinting voluntary?
No.
Okay.
No.
So
it
you
is
have to
not.
open fingerprinting.
Yes, that is, fingerprinting and mugshotting are required as a booking protocol, and if you refuse that, they will force you to do it.
Okay.
So, mere conversation. Cop walks up to you and says, hey, who's the leader of your protest? Which one of you burned down blah, blah, blah? And you have the right to say,
Are you
detaining me or am I free to go? And the cop's going to say something like, what are you afraid of? Why won't you talk to me? Blah, blah, blah. And you just say something polite like, I choose not to talk to you. And then walk away. Do you have to show your ID?
No.
Do you have to give your name, address, date of birth?
No.
Are they allowed to touch you?
No.
Can they move you?
No.
Now at the detention stage, it's going to start off the same way. The cop walks up to you and says, I want to ask you a few questions. You say,
Are
you detaining me or am I free to go?
And the cop says, I'm detaining you. And now he's allowed to do that pat-down search of the outside of your clothing. But you should respond by saying, why am I being detained? And memorize what they answer. Because if they say, we're detaining you for burglary, and then you get to court and they're charging you with disorderly conduct, the fact that he said one thing then and now another thing means that you're very likely to get your charges thrown out. So memorizing that response and making sure ideally that it's being recorded is very important. So why am I being detained? And what is the $1 million phrase that you say when he says, 'cause I said so?
Officer, what is the reasonable suspicion for detaining?
Should you articulate the reasonable suspicion for which I'm being
Ding, ding, ding. Yeah. Will you articulate the reasonable suspicion you're detaining me this evening? Or something like, I believe you're required to, articulate. And then memorize the response. Now, I'll take a quick pause on here because I forgot to mention something earlier. It is absolutely legal to record cops in almost all public circumstances. But if you are the target of cop attention, if you're the one that they're investigating, you don't get to stand there with your own phone and record the cop. They will charge you with interfering with the investigation. A few people have managed to turn their phones on and leave them on the dashboard and record, their interaction. In Oregon and many other states, we are required to put someone on notice that we're recording them. And that's either by saying, I'm recording you, or by holding a big camera in their face so that it's obvious you're recording. If I secretly am wearing one in my ear and I walk up to you or a cop and record them, and there's no way for them to know that I'm doing it, that is a crime in Oregon. It's actually a misdemeanor, and it will be totally inadmissible in court. This is one of those things that is different from state to state. If you are going to do actions in different states, if you are, you know, a mobile activist or whatnot, one of the questions you want to ask a public defender is, are you a one-party or two-party consent state? What that means is, we're a one-party. I just have to say, I'm recording you. I consent to recording, so I don't give a crap what you think. But there are certain states, particularly on the East Coast, that are a two-party state, which means if the cop doesn't feel like being recorded while being a public servant in a public place doing his public duty, that he somehow has a right to privacy, and you may be arrested if you report him. So make sure you know the law in the state where you're engaged.
So like that, does like a cell phone camera count as
Yes.
notice of recording?
Yes.
So if I have my phone, like if I'm recording on my phone and it's like in my hand, then they're on notice.
Yes.
And so it's legal even if I don't say like, can I record you?
Yeah, we advise, you know, when we do cop watching trainings, we definitely advise that you hit the record button and say, I'm recording, into your own camera.
Okay.
So that if it ended up going to court, there's your notice, you know, right on the front of it as a safety. But we do strongly believe, we actually won a federal case a couple years ago on behalf of a cop watcher, and got the right to, you know, in federal court, the right to videotape police in public places. That is now a full-blown constitutional right. But occasionally you run into wackadoodles that don't read the law or don't know the law, and they will, you know, threaten all sorts of different things. And so, if you ever do get busted for recording cops in public places with your phone or camera, I absolutely believe there is 100% a constitutional defense. Constitutional defense to any charge you get. Because public servants doing public duties in public places have no expectation of privacy. Everyone can be filmed or captured in a photograph in a public place. We don't have a right to privacy, and particularly cops don't. So you might get arrested, you might get charged with something, but it's very likely that you would win that in court. And so far, every time this has happened, when I call the prosecutor and say, this is interesting, public cop, public duty, public place, where's the right to privacy? The charges get dropped very quickly. The person still went to jail, their footage sat in jail for 2 days, like Tripp mentioned, you know, and wasn't able to be used in the press release that was wanted, but we have been pretty successful in getting cop watchers a nice little bundle of money to purchase their next camera from illegally being arrested under those circumstances. Does someone have a question?
If I had a camera on the hood of my car and I was being detained and I said, officer, I'm recording you, are they allowed to go over and turn my camera off?
They're not allowed to, but they may. They will say, and then they will attempt to say that you're interfering with their investigation by recording. But if you are doing that, that is basically the safer way to go about it. Especially if you think that something is dicey, because you know, if the reason you're recording is because you're concerned about something unlawful happening, if you don't say, I'm recording you, you can't use that footage in court. So if it does end up being an illegal arrest or they kick your ass or whatever it may be, your recording becomes worthless because it's totally not allowed to be used in court, and now you've also committed a misdemeanor that gives them a legitimate basis to arrest you.
So I was a little confused on the two-party consent states versus the right to film a public servant doing their job in a public space.
So that defense I mentioned, I think applies to all 50 states and U.S. territories. So even if it's a two-party state, if it's a public cop in a public place, I believe you have a constitutional defense. I think that those two-party states, the reason that they do it is boyfriend calls girlfriend and tries to get incriminating stuff about their pending divorce proceedings. It's normally that circumstance where the two-party consent thing is supposed to be applied. It is not supposed to be applied in the context of public demonstrations in big public places.
Right, has that specific circumstance been worked out in the Supreme Court yet? Okay, so it's
Nope.
it's
We
still
keep
a little
wanting a
bit-
test case, but like I said, every time it comes down, they dismiss the charges, so we never get to the point of having a court ruling on it.
Okay.
And just a point of amusement, it was the case Blick versus BP, Boston Police Department, which established the right to record cops. And Simon Blick is an attorney in Boston, and last year I just called him up and thanked him.
Cool. Excellent. Awesome. Okay. And so also, so detention stage I mentioned, pat down search, name, address, date of birth. Don't cough up your ID if you don't have to, or if you're not the driver of a car. Okay, arrest. Cop says you're under arrest, and you want to put that magic bubble around you, so you're going to say,
I
want to remain silent. I want to contact an attorney. Right. And even if you don't know how to spell the word attorney, let alone have one on retainer, you still say this phrase. They have to give you a phone book, a reasonable number of phone calls, and the bottom line is they can't question you anymore. Once you say that phrase, they have to stop talking to you. All right, and then they'll say, of course, we know that love rule, and you'll contact your lawyer at the station. Just as a little FYI, good luck calling a lawyer on Friday night at 3 o'clock when you're drunk and have just been taken down to the jail, in the middle of the night. No lawyers answer the phone. Occasionally, I will give that privilege out to certain activist situations where there are high stakes in place, but if you do get arrested like that, call your family to maybe come bail you out, but don't even bother calling a lawyer until the next morning, because you're just, it's going to be a futile endeavor, and it kind of almost proves that you're drunk, okay, security culture. I'm going to just briefly touch on this. We brought some outreach materials. I saw somebody else brought a really good zine on security culture, but don't brag amongst your activist community about all the great, illegal things you've done, past or present or future. That includes face crack. Every federal activist case that I've had in the last 7 years, I've gotten 60,000 pages of Facebook printouts as part of the discovery. The feds love to monitor Facebook like crazy. And so even if you say, well, I'm not putting anything up there illegal, they're psychologically profiling you. They're looking at your campaign and they're finding who is the weakest person here that we can target, or who is the big gun that we should grand jury subpoena, or other things like that. So be very careful about what you put out to the world, especially in terms of bragging and gossiping. Gossiping can include, oh, did you hear that so-and-so isn't allowed to go to the conference because they are not politically correct enough to attend this week? Or so-and-so is on the shit list, or, activist communities are super militant with each other sometimes and very vocal about their transgressions against each other. But the police and feds especially monitor that. And if someone gets outed or ousted from your movement, they get a knockety-knock from the feds because they know that person is pissed at the rest of you for being ostracized from the campaign. So be very, very careful about what you put out into the public domain. And it's just not appropriate. If people are gossiping or bragging, as their comrade, it is sort of your job to remind them that as a political activist, particularly a radical political activist, we hold ourselves to a certain standard, and everyone needs to be educated about security culture. And that's not to say that you out some 19-year-old brand new activist who, isn't fully, versed on security culture. It's a learning process. It takes practice. And if we are nurturing of each other and bringing up security culture, we will adhere to it more. My generation of forest activists was, in the late 90s when the Green Scare happened and ELF and ALF people got arrested for economic sabotage. And some of the most militant security culture freaks ended up being the biggest snitches in those cases. So just talking the talk does not mean that you will walk the walk. You really need to understand why security culture is an important part of activist ethic. And you should really take a look at the St. Paul principles on your own if you aren't familiar with what they are. Google them. And don't tell people information that they don't need to know. Not only are you potentially talking to an infiltrator or an informant, but you're putting somebody else in a dangerous position. They may not want to know that information. You may be subjecting them to a grand jury subpoena or something else, you know. And so make sure that only people who need to know information know. This includes, you know, so often I will go do lawyer duty at an action, and someone well-intentioned will come up to me and say, you know 3 people are going to walk down in a minute or 2. Don't tell me that. You know, I don't need to know that. If I was supposed to know it, someone would have told me it, not you. You know, don't think you're being helpful by sharing detailed information with others.
Just for the top one, can you go back one? For don't brag, what about like for actions that are supposed to be flashy and like build campaigns, like to post it on your own Facebook? That's, I guess, like what's the line between like trying to show off what's happened and then like bragging?
Well, I mean, if it's something that the campaign has consented on and it's part of the campaign strategy, then it's not bragging. But for you to say, come here, and say, you know, hi, I'm Lauren Regan. I was arrested 15 times, including being a suspect in the Greed Scare, and I had 2 grand. The FBI came last week to my house, blah, blah, blah. You know, sometimes we think we are giving cred to each other by going over our resumes with each other, and that's more on the line of bragging. So, vocabulary terms. The climate justice movement in particular, and radical movements in general, have been heavily targeted for infiltration, both by law enforcement officers and corporate spies, which is called gray intelligence, and I'm going to talk about that in tonight's session. An infiltrator is somebody who comes from the outside into your group. Maybe they're a convict who's working some time off their sentence by coming and trying to infiltrate into your movement. An informant is somebody who was one of you who crosses onto the dark side and gives information about your campaign to law enforcement because they got busted or something like that. A provocateur is normally a federal or state agent who comes in and not only is spying on you, but is trying to get your campaign to up the ante. They're going to be the ones that are like, burn it down, or let's go make Molotov cocktails. Or, you know, in the case of my Texas clients, the cops actually came and taught them how to build a device that ended up being a felony, whereas the campaign had no intention of going felony land with the campaign. So if someone is showing up and saying, burn it down, smash the state, they're either a provocateur or they're a very silly, misguided person who should not be trusted, needs some education, and probably needs to be talked to. If they do it a second time, they're probably a provocateur. And just to say it, and a snitch is an informant, somebody who gives information to the state about the campaign. And just to be clear with you, a snitch or an informant is not necessarily someone who gives the cops information that ends up getting somebody prosecuted or convicted. A snitch is someone that gives the state any information that they didn't already have that can be used against the movement or individuals to their, you know, negative chagrin, let's say. It is extremely rare and difficult that a campaign is able to prove that somebody in their midst is a snitch or a provocateur or an agent or a corporate spy. I get calls all the time saying, come help us figure out if this person is a snitch or not. And my response is, it's extremely difficult to do. But if there are reasons that you are not trusting someone, you should not be working with them in a sensitive way. And no one individual should ever be your webmaster, your treasurer, and hold your membership lists. And those very sensitive areas should never be given to someone who isn't known by the group and have some time invested in the campaign. The feds especially have trained an entire new cadre of FBI agents to look like 21-year-old white male, black hoodie wearing, tattooed vegan activists to infiltrate you. And what is the number one skill that they learn before they are sent out to a campaign? Webmaster. Web duties. Because every campaign is desperate for someone to do their web, and once they have access to that, they can not only screw your campaign if they just ditch you, but they can also put stuff onto your website that may not be in agreement with the campaign, or has tracking abilities within, embedded in the site that you'll never be able to get off again, basically. So be really, really cautious with that. And I don't mean, paranoia will destroy you, is the saying. People who are paranoid are immobilized. And we don't want immobilized people. We want people who are actually double and triply as active as possible and as strategic as possible. We want you to be aware, not paranoid. And the other thing I will just say, kind of in closing, is, the purpose of these trainings is also not to scare the bejesus out of people. It is to make sure that activists know the playing field that you're playing on. Because the feds work 40 hours a week and collect a paycheck to mess with you. The corporate spies get even larger paychecks to mess with you. And so we are literally trudging through mud with a ball and chain around our neck and one around our leg, and yet in the face of that, as volunteer activists, we have been immensely effective already. We are winning in a lot of different ways, but there are pitfalls that we can fall into if we don't know, where we're going and what we're doing. And so it's important to stay up on all of this information and to be safe with you and your allies that you're working with. Because especially when you're talking about climate justice campaigns, energy facilities, TransCanada, these big corporations, and we're going to talk about this in tonight's session that I'm going to make very brief. But those corporations have bazillions of dollars at stake, and you, as a fly, as an individual person, and the thousands and 99% of others like you out there can literally bring their machine down in very simple ways if you want to. And they know that, and they're becoming much more aware of how these giant megaliths of corporate, moneydom are vulnerable to a lot of different things, which makes us an even bigger threat to them, which means that they're wanting larger prison sentences, more restitution, more serious crimes, et cetera, et cetera. So, like the Black Panthers and American Indian movement and all of these other radical movements before us, we need to be serious about what we're doing, and we need to know that our enemies are very serious about stopping us, and we need to take our shit a little more serious than sometimes we do. And so, with that, so this is basically just reiterating what I just said to you with a fun little picture. And so with that, I'll open it up to, oh, whoops, I forgot I threw this in. I don't know how many of you work with undocumented communities, but just quickly, 2 things I'm going to tell you. ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, can't enter your home. If they even have a warrant, they can't enter the home without permission. So nobody has to answer the door if ICE comes to somebody's door. You're entitled to an interpreter that speaks your own language. Don't rely on your children or neighbors to interpret for you. Make them bring you in a translator. And the other thing I'm going to mention quickly, if someone is detained for immigration purposes, the immigration process right now is taking about a year between the time someone is arrested and the time they're deported. But after 6 months of being detained, those immigrants lose their lawful parental rights to their children. Their children are legally put up for adoption while they sit in a deportation facility. But if they fill out a power of attorney and grant permission to any U.S. citizen to go get their kids out of DHS custody, then you can go get the kids and send them on the bus to grandma in Mexico, or you and that parent can come up with a plan in advance, ideally, of what's going to happen to those kids. But when you're working with those communities, one of the best things that you can tell families is get this power of attorney document signed and notarized immediately. In the event something bad happens, this is the best protection to ever seeing their children again, which is a horrific consequence to anyone. And so then with that, these are just some fun pictures from cases that I've had. This is a Trans-Canada PowerPoint presentation on how you use a lock device. Nice drawings that they've come up with. And I'll talk about that a little more tonight. And we're not in Oregon, so I will skip the CD consequences. This is the Utah action camp from last year. They were stopping a mining rig. And the person on top here, just so you know, is a medic in an orange zone, risking arrest by providing water to someone out in the blazing sun who has no hands in which to drink water for. And then that we're going to go over tonight. Okay. Questions?
So I do have a question, and that is, I very much want to influence the cops, and I have gone in non-arrest situations. I mean, I will go out of my way to talk to cops because I want them to know that we are humans. I want them to understand that we have the same values that they do. I mean, I want them to look at us as who we really are, generally citizens, well, people who care about other people, who are in general trying to stop the same corporations that oppress their friends, their neighbors, etc., etc. Comments?
If you're not designated as the police liaison for that action or campaign,
This as an individual.
you should not be, I mean, my personal advice.
Unrelated to a campaign, simply as an individual.
You're just walking up to cops on the street.
I walk up to cops on the street.
I wouldn't do it, but I know definitely people, especially people who were in the 60s and 70s era tend to be a little more inclined to have human-to-human conversations with cops. Maybe it has some effect. I mean, they are probably psychologically profiling you at the same time, and I'm not sure it's very influential generally. That being said, right now I'm doing a lot of cross-movement organizing on climate justice stuff, and we talk about the fact that, if 99% of us are really going to form a mass movement and take down the system, the capitalist system, cops and their unions are going to be a part of that. And so maybe there's a place for it, but you just need to be very educated and very aware and very cautious in having those interactions. Yeah.
What are folks' rights at U.S. Customs and Canadian Customs?
You don't really have any rights at the border. And the borders right now extend 500 miles from the north and south border. So from the Canadian border and the Mexican border, they're allowed to search your car looking for immigrants, and the zone literally is 500 miles. We, as a team of lawyers, wrote to the feds, wrote to Homeland Security, and said, well, we've researched and cannot find out what people's rights are at the borders. Could you please tell us what U.S. citizens' rights are at the borders? And they declined due to national security interests. So they want to keep the information secret so that they can change the rules however they want. I will tell you, you better have a password on your phone when you're in the border areas. You should probably not bring your laptop, but just bring a thumb drive. If you have outreach materials in your car, you should probably mail them ahead and not have them on you. Because we've seen all sorts of really awful, violative actions against activists at the borders, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of redress for it.
If there is a password on the phone, are we allowed to deny?
No.
To not give that password?
You never, ever, ever have to answer any questions put to you by anyone, and so you absolutely do not have to provide your password. They may attempt to threaten you and say things. Just tell them you're going to assert your rights and not provide it.
When you're crossing a border, you don't have to be. I worked as a human rights observer, and we were told that we weren't allowed to have anything triple encrypted on our computers because it can't be broken. So I don't know. I guess I was just curious how that relates. Like when we went across borders.
Well,
so
I mean,
I guess you
why
don't have
would
to
you-
tell the password, but you can't have anything triple encrypted, and that's good. balance?
I encrypt everything, and I would never not encrypt things on my computer. Just because you cross an imaginary line between countries does not mean you give up privacy to the information on your computer. I don't know if your situation was somehow because you were acting in that role that you agreed to certain things, but there's not any general rule saying you can't have encryption or passwords or anything like that. They may seize it and hold on to it and attempt to unencrypt it, but you're never required to assist them in doing that type of
I
stuff.
think you're mentioning the level of encryption. Maybe that's why they can't force you to tell them your password. But I don't know. Okay.
Well, it seems like they could also just tell you can't go into the country unless you give them the
Correct, and that is often happening, that people are
Right.
being turned away at the border. Most what I'm hearing right now are pending charges, so you haven't been convicted of anything, but you've got a pending charge, or any kind of CD conviction. There's actually a process where you can petition the Queen to restore your rights to travel to Canada, but it's actually a really lengthy pain in the ass process.
And they did not take my passport, because all they took was information in the boat. I had 2 other people with me, and they did not take their passport numbers or anything either. Seemed real strange to me. And then actually when I came back into the United States, I just gave my passport, and they didn't check anything else. They asked a couple of questions.
The coastal boundaries, particularly for white people, are much less stringent than the nation boundaries. That 500-mile boundary that I was telling you about does not apply to the coastlines. It only applies to the horizontal boundaries. So yeah, I've had similar experiences on boats. I think unfortunately a large part of what you're experiencing is being white and being on a boat that generally means you're of a class that has some privilege, you know.
And possibly, I mean, Canada, they didn't even, it was on the phone.
Oh, at the
And when I came in the United States,
harbor.
it was face to face.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had some different experiences too. I mean, some countries, the captain of the vessel, which is usually your friend, just has to walk in with everybody's documents and you don't even...
That's coming back into the United States, but going into Canada, they didn't even, all they asked was the boat name, and it was registered that it's been in there before.
Uh-huh.
So they needed it.
Well, good. There's hope.
Surprised me.
So 500 miles, and just totally, that's like all of Washington and maybe all of Oregon or most of Oregon?
We figured it out, and it is almost all of Washington, possibly like Portland area of Oregon. It is, almost the entire state of California, into Texas, yeah, it's a huge swath. And all that it means is if they want to, they can, for search and seizure purposes mostly, they can impose border rules within those areas. And practically speaking, you see it a lot more on the southern border than the northern. The actual manifestation of that.
What jurisdictions can go and search your car based on that? Would it be DHS? Would it be Immigration Customs Authority? Would it be the LAPD? Or like depending on your jurisdiction, would it be like
Well,
the state PD?
And it really depends because the feds form joint terrorism task forces or joint border forces with local. So there are lots of circumstances where, an LA County sheriff may have been deputized as an immigration cop. Oregon actually has a specific law that does not allow that, but in other states that type of prohibition isn't in place. So it could be any law enforcement agent acting as immigration police for that purposes. And I don't know the individual states and what each one says, but I know there are websites that lay it out in detail. Yeah.
Would that have to do with like the Secure Community Acts? So that is what connects if the police were to pull over someone who was undocumented or didn't speak Spanish, they could they can call Border Patrol to come translate for them.
Secure
creating that
Communities
connection.
definitely allows local cops to help out immigration police, except in Oregon. So yeah, that is part of it. And it also is, the jails are all now computer networked, so as soon as someone with a Latino sounding name is booked into the jail, ICE knows about it within about 3 hours and can put a detention hold on that person based on that. Is there something right? Yeah.
What's the risk of being dubbed terrorists in this activist work, and like what does that mean for us as a community?
So I'll touch on it slightly tonight, but just to answer your question, there actually is no crime in federal or state law called terrorism. And there are over 100 different definitions of the word terrorism. And so really it's anything the government wants it to be. In terms of federal law, in cases I've had, there is something called the terrorist enhancement that they can add to your arson sentence or your riot sentence. And what that says is if your intention in taking that action is to coerce government into changing their position on something, then that is terrorism. So like my activist clients that burned down a wild horse capture facility, they sent a communique to the BLM saying, we burned this down so that you would change your policies on rounding up wild mustangs. And that communique was used by the government to give them the terrorist enhancement because the intention of their crime was to make the BLM change their policy in rounding up wild horses. And so now for the rest of their lives, they are a registered terrorist and can't leave the country and can't open a bank account, et cetera, as a result of that. So that's the most common manifestation, but there's also, crimes like the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. If you hinder the profits of an animal enterprise, you can be prosecuted for a federal crime of terrorism. So there are lots of gross bastardizations of the English language that have occurred, and there's not an easy answer to that question. Generally, most people believe terrorism is attempting to harm human life, but the government seems to take a much broader, whoever the enemy of the day is really a terrorist. Like one time it was communists, and it didn't matter if you really were a communist or not, if they labeled you that, consequences flowed. Now they'll just label you a terrorist and good luck finding a job in media and all those other things.
Could you just quickly, help us see where the line might or might not be if one exists, and because most actions are to, ask for change in policy.
It has to be,
ideas.
Sure. In that circumstance, it has to be a federal crime of violence, which is generally murder, arson, serious crimes of violence. There's actually a statute that lists them all out. I think we have it on our website, but 99% of any activist stuff that most people are involved in is never going to come near that line. Alright, so with that, I think we are now on dinner break, and then after dinner, we're going to do sort of a second part of this, which is some updates and trends on climate justice activism in the US in terms of slap suits and corporate spying and current prosecution tactics that we're seeing. So thank you. And take